The second viewpoint of DPC is game. Just like optimization, a game can be used as a common English word, but in this case we got a very unambiguous formal definition of a game. Now, power control clearly is a competition among the different transceiver peers. Now, we can model competition as well as cooperation with games. So the kind of formal language of games that we're going to be looking at will extend our intuitive understanding, where we have a set of players, say M players and transceiver peers in this particular case, and each has a certain strategy set. It's a set of possible strategies that he can play, and then there is a certain payoff function that says if you play a certain strategy and other players play other strategies, then these will lead to a particular reward coming to you or a cost coming to you. So we define a game formally as a three-tuple. So 1, 2, 3 things. First is a very simple set of players. So indexed by I, 1, 2, 3 up to n. And then for each of these players, say indexed by I, we have a certain set, A sub I. And there are many possible elements that could be living in the set. And each of these elements is a possible strategy. For example, in soccer, if I have a goal here and a goalkeeper, okay, and the goalkeeper thinking, should I go left, or should I go right to catch the ball, that would be a strategy set with two strategies. And then there will be a payoff function. And this usually maps some element in the set into a particular real number, say 5 or -3 and so on. And if these numbers model something desirable, then it's called a payoff function, or in general a utility function, as we will see in future chapters. If it's representing something bad, undesirable outcome, then it would be a cost function. So of course you would like to maximize your payoff function or minimize your cost function for each player, varying only the strategy that's in your own control. That is, pick a particular point in this set. For example, the goalkeeper going left and the ball turns out come over here, then you lose. And this may be a -5, say, of costs. Whereas if you catches it, then you will get a reward of, say, 10. Okay. So that is the function that map the strategy that you choose to a number. Now, of course, it's determined in part by your decision, but also in part by whoever is kicking the ball. So there comes the coupling of everybody's strategy. Your strategy and her strategy together determine the outcome. Now we're going to later come back to our power control and view it as a game. But first, let's take a look at two simple but very famous examples. Perhaps by far the most famous example of simple game theory is the so-called prisoner's dilemma. It's a two-user game, modeling competition, and each user has two possible strategies. So we can plot this in a two-dimensional space, in a table on a piece of paper with two columns and two rows. Okay. Let's say the two rows represent the two strategies for player A, and the two columns represent the strategies for player B. And players A and B are suspects of a crime, and the police is going to investigate into this crime and examine both of them individually. So they are going to know the entries in this table later on, but they cannot communicate because they are being questioned separately. And let's say they have two choices to make. One is you do not confess, no confess. The other is you confess. Similarly, B can also say, I don't confess, or I confess. So there are altogether four possible outcomes. For each of these outcomes jointly determined by A's strategy and B's strategy, there will be a pair of numbers. The first number denotes the payoff to A, and the second the payoff to B. So if they both decide not to confess, then the police can only charge them with a lesser crime, and they will each get, say, 1 year in prison. Whereas if they both confess, then they will be sent to prison for a longer term, say 3 years. Whereas if one confess but the other not confess, then the one that confess will be rewarded and walk away free for cooperating with the investigation, and the other one will be left with a most severe penalty of, say, 5 years in the prison. And this is a symmetric game, so we also have this cell filled out exactly like this one. Okay, if B confessed, then she walks away with nothing, 0 years, and A do not confess, then she will be getting 5 years. Okay, so this defines the game, the prisoner dilemmas game, because there are two players, each has a strategy set consisting of two possible strategies, and this table quantifies the payoff for each player, jointly determined by their respective strategies. So let's take a look at this famous prisoner's dilemma. Why is it called dilemma? Because imagine you are suspect A, and you say, I don't know what B will do. But suppose she chooses not to confess, then what should I do? Well, if I don't confess, I guess -1. If I confess, I get 0. So I should pick confess. We call this the best response strategy by player A in response to player B's picking no confession. But B may also choose to confess. I don't know. And in that case, what should I do? Well, I'm basically comparing -5 and -3 here. Still, confess is the better choice. Relative to -5, -3 is better. Therefore, confess is also the best response strategy if B chooses to confess. Now, B can only choose between two choices. So, A would say, hey, I have the same best response strategy no matter what. That is called a dominant strategy. If it is the best response strategy for all possible strategies by the other player. In this case, that is confess. Now, by symmetry, B is thinking in exactly the same way. And B will also pick confess as the dominant strategy. And therefore, the outcome of this game will be that both A and B will confess and get 3 years each. And what's wrong with that? Why is it called dilemma? Because they could have got 1 year each. If you think about the summation of the payoffs, and you want to, for each I, maximize this quantity, then -2 would be much better than -6. Except A and B cannot collaborate or communicate. So in their each strategization process, they end up picking a socially suboptimal solution. And that's why it's called a dilemma. So in what we just talked about, we have defined the best response strategy in a game and the dominant strategy in a game. Now, there may not be a dominant strategy, as we'll see right away. Now, this is another famous example called the coordination game. Suppose there are two users, again, you and your friend, and one night you decide that maybe you should go watch a movie. And let's say there are two kinds of movies, action and romance. So again, each player has two choices in the action strategy set, action versus romance movie, for you, player A, and also for player B. Two strategies, action or romance. Now suppose you two decide different kinds of movies, then there is no agreement and you decide not to watch a movie and you get 0 payoff, so both of you. Okay, this for you, This is for your friend, this is for you, this is for a friend. But suppose you both pick the same kind, then you get some strictly positive return, except the returns value are different to you and to your friend. Say you prefer action. So if you two both agree on action movie, then you get 2 units of reward and B only get 1 unit. And conversely, let's say your friend B likes romance movie more than action movie, so if the outcome is going to see a romance movie, then B gets 2 and you get 1. So obviously you both have the incentive to try to reach some kind of consensus. Okay. But you still would like to compete, because depending on what kind of consensus it is, you'll be getting different kinds of payoffs. So again, now we have defined a game, a coordination game. The set of players, which is A and B, for each user, there is a strategy set, 2 possible strategies, and the payoff functions basically map action to 2 for A, 1 for B, maps romance to 1 for A, 2 for B, and it maps romance action or action romance to 0 for both players. That's the payoff function. So now we have completely specified this game. Let's understand the behavior here. Now clearly there are best response strategies. For A, if B chooses action, then the best response is action, because 2 is bigger than 0. But if B chooses romance, then A's best response strategy is romance, because 1 is bigger than 0. So now you see that there is no dominant strategy, because the best response strategies for different B's choices will be different. Similarly, B does not have a dominant strategy either. However, we see that their best response strategies actually click, they match. What do I mean by they match? Well, if A chooses action, then the best response by B with respect to that is action. Similarly, if B chooses action, then the best response with respect to that for A is also action. So the action strategy choices by A and B is one that matches. Same story for romance. So you see that these 2 best responses are actually clicking with the 2 best responses respectively by B. And in general, we can define what we call the Nash equilibrium. Basically, it is an equilibrium that describes strategic players' unilateral lack of incentive to move away from this choice. Notice this word equilibrium is not the same as the equilibrium we saw earlier, which used to describe the convergence of iterative algorithm to a particular point. In fact, we later see yet another notion of equilibrium. So more precisely, let's say that there are 2 users. Okay? And user 1 got utility U1, user 2 got utility U2. And user 1 got a strategy set, script A. And user 2 got strategy set, script B. And we say that a particular point, call that A star, and a particular point B star in A and B sets respectively is called a Nash equilibrium if the following definitions are true. First, the first user's utility at this point, A star, B star, will be no smaller than the utility where user 2 sticks to B star and user 1 is free to pick any A in the set of possible strategies. Okay, that's for all A in the set A. This simply says that, hey, if the other player doesn't move away from B star, I have no incentive to move away from A star. And, that's the keyword, and at the same time, the other user feels the same way. You too, at this A star, B star, is no smaller than the utility for user 2 if A star remains there and B is free to be chosen anywhere in the set. Okay, so this B can be any point in the set. Doesn't matter. What it says is that for user 2, again, I have no unilateral incentive to move away from B star. If the other player sticks to A star, I'm going to stick to B star. And the key thing is that both statements must be true for the single point A star, B star. That's what we mean by matching best responses. And if so, we call this A star, B star point a Nash equilibrium. It says there's no unilateral incentives to change my strategy away from A star, B star. So in this case, there are two Nash equilibria. The action is a Nash equilibrium because neither A nor B has a unilateral incentive to move away from this choice. And there's another Nash equilibrium, romance. And back to the prisoner's dilemma, this confess is the unique Nash equilibrium. Even though both realize it's better to go there, but there's no unilateral, that's the key word, incentive to move away from this point. Basically, A says, if you don't move, I don't move. B says, well, if you don't move, I don't move. And they both are stuck in this socially suboptimal, unique Nash equilibria. So we see that Nash equilibria may not exist. Well, both examples we just saw, they exist. It may not be unique if it exists. We saw an example with two Nash equilibria. And none of the Nash equilibria might be socially optimal, maximizing the summation of payoffs, or even be Pareto optimal. However, by a very fundamental result by John Nash in his PhD dissertation at Princeton, he showed that as long as you allow each player to flip a coin and probabilistically decide which strategy to choose, then in that so-called mixed strategy scenario, there will always exist at least a Nash equilibrium. Now back to our power control problem. We said power control is competition, and competition can be modeled as a game. So what kind of game are we talking about here? Well, let's identify the set of players first. Well, that's the logical link or the transceiver pair, and there are n of them. Let's identify the strategy space here. It becomes a little more complicated. In the two examples we just saw, the strategy space is pretty simple. It's just two choices. But here is a continuum of the power levels for each user I, such that the target SIR gamma is achieved. Now, as you can see, the strategy space, so defined, is a set of P's that's determined in part by what the other user's P's might be, because that would determine how easy or hard is it for you to achieve the target SIR. So it's through the coupling of strategy space instead of the coupling of payoff function that we see the interference phenomena reflected in the power control game here. Because the payoff function is very simple, you basically want to look at a cost function, that is pi. You want to make this small. So that is the definition of the game. And here are two simple but important facts. Fact number one, you can easily verify for yourself, is that the DPC algorithm, what is that algorithm again? It says that the transmit power for each transmitter I at time t plus 1 is the current transmit power times the ratio between the target SIR and the current SIR at time t. And this goes on for all the users. This actually is the best response strategy in response to all the other players' strategies. Whatever they might be, they are reflected through the SIR value. And by changing my power level this way, changing my strategy this way to the next time slot, I'm basically executing the best response strategy. The second thing you can check is a monotonicity of the strategy space. What do I mean by that? By that I mean that if all the other users make their powers pj, j not equal to me, I'm user I, smaller, okay, make these smaller, then my strategy space, the set of p's such that the gammas can be achieved, will be bigger. Now this is obvious once I state it, right? Because if you reduce your transmit power, I have less interference, so I have more choices of p, smaller values of p that can still give me my target gamma. And this is what I mean by monotonicity of the strategy space. It turns out that there's a special name for this kind of game, and subject to some technical condition that holds in this case, we say that best response strategies, iterations of best responses, will converge to an equilibrium, to a Nash equilibrium, provided the strategy spaces for all the users are monotonic in the sense that we just described. So we won't have time to go through the proof of that, but this is one way in addition to the optimization method that we'll go through in the advanced material part of the lecture to prove convergence of distributed power control algorithm.